Okay guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 2 of my interview with Stavros Danos of Aries Cerat. If you missed part 1, I highly encourage you watch it. You don't have to watch them in order, but part 1 included background on the company as well as a focus on the Aurora speaker that intrigued me so much at Axpona. And I think that interview part will give you probably the same impression I did. It was a very anomalous speaker in terms of what I saw from stereotypical speaker design, but after you hear that interview and the reasons behind it, you almost start wondering, is everybody else doing it wrong and he's doing it right? Because it certainly makes sense, a lot of the things he's doing there. So that's a very good interview if you want to learn a little bit more about that speaker and the company. This will piggyback on that in terms of showcasing the electronics, which are equally innovative. This inverted triode is very fascinating, and the Triode FET. They're doing tubes, but they're doing it in a way that mitigates a lot of the stereotypical problems with tubes or flavors of tubes that people have come to have to just accept. This is different, and so when he explains it, and then you can tie it into your listening impressions, and it starts to all make some sense, even if some of this is over your head. One of the good takeaways, if you can stick it out, I understand Zoom interviews are not that easy to follow, and it gets kind of technical, but the passion, the innovativeness, the desire to push things forward, I think will come through and are worth your time. As well as the distributor will chime in several respects to share his experience over many years with hundreds of different brands and why Aries Cerat resonates so well with him and has set a new bar for brands that he carries. And then there's really another valuable thing, if you can stick it out all the way through. We talk about digital, and he gives some general advice. He talks about his digital products, obviously, but some general advice that's really good about, we sometimes are too married and overvalue measurements, especially in the digital side. Signal to noise ratios. Once you get past a certain point, I mean, it's immaterial, and there's so many other things that you need to start considering that can give you different qualities of performance. And so it's good to hear that from a guy like Stavros. And, you know, I'm a measurement guy. I value measurements. There's not a company out there that doesn't use measurements in building products, and it helps you determine if something is well engineered or if it's broken. There's value in measurements, but it's also important to have this other perspective too of when it's applicable and then when it's immaterial and a point where you shouldn't be ranking things and married to that for your buying decision. So just some practical advice he's going to give you that I think is very valuable. So hopefully you enjoy. The only negative I can find with Aries Cerat is now I want a piece of gear. I just can't figure out which one to buy. And then the other problem is I know if I buy one, I'm going to want the whole ecosystem, kind of like MBL. I kind of want to get the whole thing if I ever do MBL. But I did go and eat Chinese today. The fortune cookie said I'm due to make some money, serious money soon. So maybe that means full MBL system coming soon, Aries Cerat system, and then something else. I've already spent 2 of the system. Let me think of a third. You guys can help me. But I think after this interview, you'll see why Aries Cerat is now on my wish list. Certainly, if I win the lottery, of a system that I'd love to create a whole room of their gear. So enjoy part 2.
Okay, so yeah, in this part, I think we focus on the electronics since we covered the speakers and your background. So one thing I did want to jump into talking about, which is so innovative and unique, you've never seen, at least I've never seen, this inverted triode design that you use for your electronics amplification. So Stavros, can you talk a little bit more about that and what was the genesis of that?
So the concept is not new. It's about 100 years old. There was very little data out there. There was some experiments made about 100 years back. But they did not expand to it. So I got the opportunity and we made our own experiments. I can say that we probably own most of the data on this operation. Out there, we did our research and there is almost nothing from 100 years now. So we developed this technology. We tried to expand and gather as much data as into it. So let's say the idea of using the grid as an anode and anode as a grid is not did not be created by us, but we expand this idea and we make the first and probably the only commercial or ready-made product with this technology, not just in audio, in electronics in general. The main aspect of this technology is not that the sum, it's more than its, let's say, the result is more than the sum of its ingredients. So in theory, you'll get the benefit of near zero input capacitance and very, very low output impedance. So I'll give you an example of the benefits of the low output impedance. Let's say you have an output transformer, very nice quality output transformer, and you drive it with a relatively low internal impedance tube, like let's say 300B, which is a very nice tube to drive transformers. Keeping all parts the same, transformers, power supplies, of course, modifying to be used with the inverted triode. With the inverted triode, you get 10 times more bandwidth with the same transformer. So let's say your output transformer with the 300B goes from 20 hertz to, let's say, 50 kilohertz. Just keep the same transformer, don't change anything, drive it with the inverted triode, and you get 4 hertz to 600 kilohertz. So crazy wide bandwidth, and its input capacitance is near zero. So you have the benefit as well to have a very easy load on the driver. So we expand on this technology, we tried and gathered data from our experiments. We invested a lot of money in acquiring a lot of type of tubes and trying to see which geometries work, which geometries do not, and spend thousands of hours, you know, trying to get data, because there is zero data out of it. There is no, let's say, transfer curves available. There are no tube life data. There is zero. So I think we're proud to say that we own most, if not all, of the data on this technology. That's why we're comfortable to offer a lot of designs that do use this technology in our preamps and in our Legend series sources. For example, the Legend series DAC and the Legend series Phono do use this technology as well in their output stages. That's why they have this big gap of performance from even the limited edition stuff because of the use of this technology in the output stage.
Yeah, so for a layperson, though, who doesn't understand, it kind of would take the traditional negatives of tubes and not being able to deliver current or mating with certain types of speakers. You've kind of flipped that on its head, and really, you can't judge your tube amp in the same way that you would normally judge other tube amps. And is that a good way of?
This is for the triode FET, a good way to describe the triode FET. The inverted triode is the same thing. Let's say it's acting like a step-down transformer in electron real, let's say. So it's like using a tube as a step-down transformer in using electrons. It also does something else because of the kinetic energy of the electrons is much different than in a normal triode. And also the mechanism of restricting electron flow and accelerating the electrons is very different than a triode. And in my opinion, this is how the whole sound of the inverted triode is, because let's say it's not just the lower input capacitance and lower output impedance, which determines the sound result. It's also the differences in the kinetics of the electrons inside the tube, which is vastly different, the way that you control the electron flow. And this is, in my opinion, why the big difference is. That's why I say the result is much more than the sum of its technical differences between a triode and a inverted triode. And people that hear it, it's like, they say it's like an accordion, it's like a big curtain lifting, wherever you use this. It's like not adding more info, but it's like getting, retrieving info which is there, but invisible sort of, or masked. And I think this technology is, let's say it's not an infant because we already use it for about 10 years now. We're very comfortable to have a lot of data in terms of reliability and such. We are already on generation 3, which is used in only the Aggetto for so far. It's personally my favorite preamp just because of it uses the latest and greatest we have in this technology. But it has its, let's say, downsides, which is not, it has again maintenance. So it requires to change the tube a little bit more often than a normal tube, but it's definitely worth it.
Interesting. Yeah, so along those lines, some more innovative stuff under the hood and on top of the Triode FET in the inverted Triode technology as well. You give the ability to change the bias of the tubes, which is something and
yes,
almost encourages part of a tailoring customization. And so we briefly touched on this off camera, but maybe you can share with us. I mean, you're treating audiophiles like experienced people who know what they're doing, which is definitely kudos there. But also, can you talk about the balancing act of them maybe not knowing what they're doing and sometimes always having to call you for advice and how you balance that trade-off?
Well, it was a rough decision to give this option. It's always a double-edged sword when you give too much options to an end user. Sometimes, especially, you know, hobbyists, they do love to play. You know, if you see the amount of twigs and cables in the market, you know that people like to play around. So if you give them a tool, especially when it's free and you can do it on the fly, that's the most important thing. You can do it while the music is playing. It's like giving them an endless toy to play with. So this is not always a good thing because they will never rest. They will always play and try. But in my opinion, this rises from the question what sounds best in a system, because let's say a DAC will sound, it leaves the, let's say, our listening room with the setting, but let's say your system is a bit more dull or a bit more bright. You can change the sound of the DAC, not much, so it's not inducing, you know, too much character, but the difference is so small. It's like changing some cable, for example, or a tube rolling, the same differences. So it's like tube rolling, but free. So you don't have to buy expensive, you know, go from Muller to tank soles and to some nice nose varieties. You can do that with the bias. Now, tube rolling is also expanding the options because you change the tube. Now the operating point to be optimal is different, but with the bias option, you can find that point. So it also gives you a vast, let's say, palette of sounds to play with. I'll give you an example. Let's say you go from a Mullary to ATF to a Siemens or back to a Westinghouse. They have different sweet spots. If you didn't have this option, then you're going to have, let's say, trial and an error. Or let's say you will put a Supreme tube, you know it's Supreme, but it doesn't sound good. Why? Because it's not biased correctly. It's out of its optimal working range. Now with the flip of a knob, you can find that optimal position. Now it has two drawbacks. First, it does not allow the audiophile to rest. It gives you a lot of toys to play with. And second, you need to be aware that there is a range. So sometimes we limit it artificially, the range you can play with, or that other times we give strict directions of which limits to play with, or you can have, let's say, some safe features, you know, mute the preamp while you're doing it, you know, disconnect the speakers, stuff like that, small, if you're not sure what you're doing. But most of our latest generation have built-in meters, and you can do it on the fly while you're listening, especially if you know what you're doing and you're not afraid to move some knobs while the lid is open. But yeah, and especially if you have a full system, that means you can change phono, DAC, preamp, amplifier, biases. So it's like having a huge palette, and you can fine tune the sound to your taste because, you know, if we're being honest, a room doesn't sound the same. A speaker will never sound the same. Speakers sound different, so you can tune it to your taste, and not all ears are the same. For example, I have some people that They have bright amplifiers. I know they're bright, and I tell them, put the DAC at that setting. It will tame your amplifier down. So it really opens up a lot of possibilities to fine-tune the sound to your needs without too much hassle. You see many people change cables or racks or whatever when they change a component because they imbalance their, let's say, their fine-tuned sound, which they already had. But now you can very fast bring it back to your ideal sounding.
Yeah, and if somebody stays within the ecosystem of Aries Cerat and even has your speakers, you probably can give them the parameters that you like for that ecosystem. But this allows for better mixing and matching, perhaps helping to make the amp better to a different speaker. So yeah, this is extremely powerful and beneficial. And
this
anybody that likes to go ahead.
Sorry, this is very apparent to people that have full systems. They will play around, but when they settle down, they will settle down to the values I had, for example, right. Because I know they will free to play around and mess around. Or for example, I will have people that have a couple of systems, mix and full Aries Cerat. So they will say, okay, when I play with your speakers, I will revert to these settings. When I change speakers, I go to that settings. And it's, for me, when you have a lot of experience with your equipment, let's say, or my equipment, I know beforehand that, okay, you're going to like this setting or that setting beforehand. Let's say you switch to a very high power, solid state amplifier. Okay, you want to do that, probably it will sound better to you. So it's pretty predictable if you have a lot of experience, and it's quite telling. I have, as you said, a lot of people try to call and say, okay, how do you do this with the bias? How do you change the sound more to this? And it's very predictable sometimes what people will like to tune the sound to. So yeah, it's let's say an official database we have about tastes and biasing positions.
Yeah, and along those same lines, one thing that I noted is that your preamp, in terms of what gain it offers, and your amp in terms of the gain and variability, you've in your own ecosystem, you've got something that works good, but then you've also got further adjustments. I think you have gain controls so that if somebody uses a different preamp that doesn't provide the same gain, you can kind of meld those. Maybe if you could talk about that in a little more detail.
Yeah, so my philosophy is that it's better when you design a full system to act in unison, not a mix and match. But of course, this is an ideal. But the way I design is our equipment is that I try to distribute the gain as much as possible. So normally an amplifier will have too much gain, and then we'll try to destroy that gain in a preamp. This is how it usually works. And then you have a very low output source, about 1 volt or 2. So what we try to do is we give very low gain in the amplifier, very few stages. Our amplifiers are 1 or 2 stages, one being the Triode FET, which is, let's say, a bit of an exemption to the rule. But usually we have 2-stage amplifiers, very low gain. And then we have preamps, which are moderate and also high gain and very high output sources. So what you try to do is you distribute the gain throughout the chain. So you have low gain devices which always sound better, low gain always simpler circuits, especially when you have no feedback. They always sound much more open and better. The simpler the better. Especially it helps when you have a DAC which is 10 volt output. That means that you can save at least 1 or 2 stages along the chain. Also, you lower the noise because, let's say, you have an amplifier which is 30 dB in input, and then you have an amplifier which is 8 dB gain. So the noise on its input is will be amplified much more in a high gain. So you lower the noise floor of your system for free if you have low gain devices along the chain. It's like a free gift. If you have a DAC which is 1 volt and a DAC which is 10 volts, then without changing anything, you'll get 10 times more lower noise floor throughout the chain just because of that higher level DAC. Without changing anything, no cable change, no ground changes. It's like a free meal if you have a very high output source.
Yeah, so there's obviously huge benefits, and I heard it firsthand, keeping in the ecosystem of Aries Cerat, but we also at Robert's house got to see how it can mate and you can use these controls. So again, something that you don't often get with other equipment, and you kind of just have to mix and match. And if you don't understand things to the level that Stavros just mentioned, sometimes people are on this constant gear merry-go-round and making good choices in a vacuum with these pieces, but they don't mate together for some of the reasons that Stavros just said. So it's important to kind of either learn what Stavros is talking about in more detail when matching your equipment, or stay within the ecosystem of the brand like an Aries Cerat.
What we tried to do with, let's say, during the last years, we tried to give some options, factory options in terms of gain of the preamps, but we also have built-in switches. For example, we have a system both on the sources and the preamps, which you can flip the gain by reconfiguring the output transformer. So it's not done with resistors, it's not done by attenuators. You reconfigure the output transformer to have a higher step down or a lower step down ratio. So this way you fine tune the gain to your system so you have maximum range in your volume controller. And also lately on the Janus range, we included a full TVC system on its input. So you can adjust the gain in 6 steps. With steps of 4 dB, so you can get a full range of 20 dB attenuation, transformer attenuation, which is at the highest level in terms of quality, in my opinion. So it's not like a resistor attenuator or switching the feedback ratios, etc. So you have a true TVC input, which is bypassable, of course, if you use our preamps. But let's say you want to use a preamp which is high gain or low gain, you don't need to change anything. You just flip the TVC switch in the back and you're set to go. You have full range in your volume, and that's it. You don't need to worry about mix and match.
Yeah, and for me, this is so rare to see in a piece, but to me, this just speaks high end. I mean, this is what you would want from a piece. Not only when you stay in their ecosystem, you have the optimal, but they're also thinking about people that want to mix and match and providing still means of which you can get state-of-the-art performance. So kudos to you on that, because we don't see that much. But you did touch briefly on digital, so maybe with some of the time remaining, we can talk about your philosophy on digital in the electronics realm.
Digital is a nice matter. The digital is, in my opinion, is and was a race in numbers. Unfortunately, people will focus on, back then it was a race in bit rate and in bit depth. In my opinion, it's a bit of exaggeration of the industry in how they wanted to push things. Because as an example, an average recording will have a dynamic range of about, translated to about 12 bit only. And some very good ones, with very high caliber microphones and very nice microphone amps, preamps, regardless of, the rest of the chain, will have a maximum dynamic range equivalent to about 14 bits. And that's independent how you record it. You can record it to 128 bits, doesn't matter. The true dynamic range stops at 14 bits maximum. So it doesn't matter where it's recorded, the quality of the equipment. It's the limit of the physical limit of the microphones and the ambient noise floor, which is the hard limit. You cannot surpass that. Now, what happens to the rest of the bits? That random noise. Even in 32-bit recordings, okay, they can sell you your music back, 100 times every month. You can buy your music in another bit rate, but it's still 14-bit bit depth. That's it. So the let's say the battle of bit rate is a good for, let's say, in general the industry to move forward, but in my opinion, it's just a way to move boxes and recordings Now, bit rate is another story. The higher the bit rate, the better. If it's native, so if something is recorded at 48, it's very different if it's recorded at 380, 84, for example. Huge difference. As long as it's native and it's not upsampled, which is usually the case, unfortunately, you know, they will try to sell your music back upsampled. You know, that's you know, story for another video maybe. But in my opinion, there are much more things in digital audio that they will see the surface. And voice, you know, and it really tells sign is that you'll see many old designs sound much better than, you know, some state-of-the-art, you know, 140 dB dynamic range DACs, which they will sound like a toys comparison to some other vintage DACs. And you'll say, you know, what gives? There are other things that are much more important than the measurements, the typical measurements that you see in magazines. These measurements have their merit when you are engineering something. You want to have, let's say, a compass, a technical compass where you're going and to verify if you're doing is correct. But there are much more important things in digital and in analog and in amplification as well than the strict numbers, and this translates to most things in audio, amplifiers, distortion, damping factor. You know, it gives you a lot of, let's say, data points to an end user, which is, in my opinion, most of the time useless, and don't tell the half story, or they're a very good way to sell you something that will not sound optimal. And that's why you see new DACs every month come and go. So it tells a lot about that something is wrong. Now, it's the difficult thing is how to evaluate a digital source, you know, from paper or from a magazine or from pictures or from just technical data. That's the most difficult thing to do, even for an engineer, to say, okay, what's this guy doing? So the proof is in the pudding. Just listen to something. If it sounds real, then it's in the right direction. Otherwise, you just buy a sound card, which is in measurements, is next to perfect, and be done. But as we know, it's not how it goes in the audio.
Yeah, so
I'd like to mention something here, if possible. We've, as a company, we've AB'd just slightly over 100 different digital devices over the past 20 years. And we've tested DACs up to $120,000 US. Our favorite and our reference DAC right now is the Aries Cerat Cassandra reference. It's about 130 pounds. The reason we like it is it just sounds analog. And we've found that if you're trying to get digital to sound great, it ends up being about the harmonics that you can get from a turntable. And Stavros is producing as close to a turntable as we've ever heard in digital products.
Yeah, well, I'd echo that based on what my listening impressions have been in both Robert's house and in other places. But yeah, it's great to hear not only the tech side of your expertise, but you're giving very practical common sense advice that isn't often shed in the industry, that a lot of these measurements are somewhat meaningless, certainly once you get past a certain point, and certainly in digital. So, and then people get, you know, married to thinking that's how you should rank things. And so that is great advice that I don't want people to overlook that was just shared. So of all the tech talk stuff and covering electronics, digital, speakers, definitely want to get that out the way. But I got to get to something that I love a lot about your company and your products is the aesthetics and the attention you pay to just every little detail. I got to give you thumbs up on the look. The RAM logo, can you give any reason for that? Any background on that?
The logo?
Yeah.
So that's a nice story. The Aries Cerat means in Latin, the horns of the ram, of Mouflon. So if you see, it's like a visual pun that the horns are actual horns. So it's like a visual pan intended to the logo. Now the logo started as I'm an Aries, so we said, okay, let's do Aries, the horns of the Aries.
Okay.
Also, buffalo is the national animal of Cyprus. It's a protective species.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So it was like a dual meaning to the whole, let's say, logo.
Yeah, and your whole way of etching it is more than just the normal way, the thickness, everything top notch. But really the thing that blew me away looks wise was once I saw the speaker, and this is what I got to ask about while we're just about out of time, but wanted to ask about the finish on the Aurora, this liquid copper and this liquid carbon fiber. Can you just briefly talk about that? It's one of the best finishes I've ever seen.
Yeah, that's a proprietary finish. We developed it in-house, so it's never been done before. We had to develop special equipment to actually be able to do that. And now if you see close looking and use hard gliding on it, you see that the copper waves are embossed inside and they're frozen in liquid glass, in crystal glass. So they're actually 3D waves frozen in time and covered in very thick. So I'll give you an example. A maximum thickness of the copper waves is about 2-3 millimeters. And there are another 2-3 millimeters of clear, let's say, glass on top of it. So approximately there is 5 to 6 millimeters of thickness. And it's hand applied and hand sanded, hand polished. It's a very elaborate procedure. It takes a couple of months to about a month for the Aurora. For Contendo, it took about eight months in total to do it. But the Contendo is much bigger surfaces. So imagine a full speaker, 2-ton speaker to be covered in that finish. You know, that's a Contendo.
It's amazing. And I know the design itself of the Aurora can be polarizing from a distance, but I encourage anybody, if you get a chance to see that speaker up close and that liquid copper, a liquid carbon fiber finish, there's really nothing like it. And yeah, kudos to you on that. Really, I mean, at every point, I feel very confident saying you're delivering a true high-end experience from aesthetic to design. Everything is, you know, my intuition has been justified with everything I've seen. I'm glad you've been able to share some of that with us. I did want to just touch while we had a few more minutes. There was one quote I've seen you say that I've always echoed, been a big mission of my statement in terms of room treatments and stuff like that. And you were talking about, I think that when people have equal budgets, sometimes audiophiles will spend it on cable elevators versus room treatments. And so that was another thing that echoed with me, that you gave some practical advice that is really the reverse equation that people should be using.
It's that's a very good talking point. And I will be more general than just let's say room treatment versus tweaks. It's more like where do you put your funds and what is most important, and how do you make the proper choices in upgrading. You'll see that people in this hobby make very rational decisions when they try to upgrade. For example, I've seen people that they interconnect an USB cable to their DAC. It costs as much as their DAC, for example, which is like, okay, how do you explain this? You know, these funds could be allocated to improve something much more in value. Or for example, if they sold all their cables or their tweaks, they could buy, you know, 3 scales up of a speaker from the same manufacturer. I'm not saying that, let's say, sell it to get our things, just even from the same series. It doesn't make any sense. Of course, it's a big industry, the tweaks and whatnot, but it really doesn't make any sense in technical terms. You know what we do here? We in our place and in some shows, we go with plain, nothing, no tweaks, no cables, nothing, and we say, okay, if you can have this sound with bare minimum, this is what you are after. And then of course you can have much better sound if you get expensive cables. You have much better sound if you have, let's say, proper support to your equipment, proper platforms, proper vibration isolation. but you have to see these things in context. Okay, you cannot have a rack which costs more than your equipment put on it. It doesn't make any sense in any kind of way. You know, you can get much better sound if you have a top-notch DAC in the floor, but a subpar DAC on a 30 kb platform. And this is what I see in this hobby is very wrong allocation in what people choose to spend their money on.
Yeah, that's great advice. And so, again, we're running out of time, but just wanted to thank you again from both practical advice and information on your equipment. I've got to go back and revise a video I did a few months ago on best brands in the world. I was just focusing on ones that did it all, and I didn't know you did speakers. And now that I've had more exposure, Aries Cerat is arguably, especially within its ecosystem, could be considered easily top of the list in that regard. So thank you so much for the interview. Bob, did you have anything else you wanted to add at the end?
No, I think you pretty well covered it. I would just say that I think Stavros is 100% correct in stating that you need to have a basis to a system before you start tweaking it out. And we've worked with many manufacturers over the years. This is the most reliable and the best sounding product I've ever heard by a large margin. Stavros mentioned the Agito preamplifier. I've ordered one for myself after having one in my listening room for basically 2 weeks. And it's by far one of the most mesmerizing audio products that I've ever tested in my life. So all I can say is I feel fortunate to work with Aries Cerat. That's the best way I can put it to you.
Well, I feel fortunate for this interview and getting to know you guys better. Hopefully we can do it again sometime next time you release a new product. So again, want to wrap things up. Thanks again to Robert, who's not on video right now, but if he's still with us, thank you, Robert, for having exposure to your systems in California. And I hope you guys have a great week, and we'll be talking soon.
Thank you very much. Have a great week. Cheers.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks. Bye.